Cowboy, I came to marry you. I'm the little Apache girl you saved 20 years ago. The wind carried the smell of dust and horses across the dry land, the same land where blood had once seeped into the soil, where screams had mingled with the calls of ravens. He remembered that day, though he had tried to bury it deep beneath whiskey and silence. A raid, a fire, a child with eyes wide as the desert sky, trembling in the shadows of death. He had lifted her from the ashes, a half-starved bundle of bones and spirit, her tiny fingers clutching his shirt as though her soul had found its anchor. He had taken her to safety, then left her to her people, believing his role had ended. But the land has a way of holding debts, and now she stood before him, no longer a child but a woman forged by the wild, her body scarred and strong, her gaze unflinching. Her outstretched hand trembled with neither fear nor hesitation. Her arm was painted with the symbols of her ancestors, lines of charcoal and ochre weaving stories across her skin. The horse behind her shifted, its eyes dark pools of patience, as though it, too, had been waiting for this moment. The cowboy's hand hovered in the air, weathered from years of ranching, gunfights, and loneliness. He wanted to speak, to ask how she had found him after all these years, but the words caught in his throat. All he managed was silence, the kind of silence heavy enough to echo. She stepped closer, her bare feet pressing into the earth like roots claiming old ground. "You saved me," she said, her voice low but carrying the strength of mountains. "And in my people's way, a life given must be returned. I was told to honor you, to repay that gift. I have come to give myself." Her eyes softened then, not with submission but with the fire of choice. "Not as a debt, but as the woman I have become. I am here to bind my life with yours." He looked at her, truly looked, past the wild hair tangled by wind, past the dirt and the feathers braided into strands, past the scars carved into her skin by survival. He saw the girl he had carried from flames, the child who had looked at him as though he were more than a gunslinger, more than a drifter in a world too cruel for softness. He saw the years that had sharpened her into steel, yet left her heart unbroken. And in that gaze, he felt the earth shift beneath him. The horse snorted, pawing at the ground as though urging him to answer. The cabin loomed behind him, a lonely shelter that had never truly been a home. He thought of the long nights, the empty bottles, the prayers muttered into dark skies that no one had answered. Now the answer stood before him, fierce and unyielding, offering him something he had forgotten could exist, belonging. Slowly, he extended his hand toward hers. The distance between them was no longer measured in steps or years, but in the single heartbeat that carried her past into his present. Her fingers brushed his, warm and strong, and in that touch he felt the weight of 2 decades dissolve. He did not yet know if he could be the man she believed him to be. He only knew that he could no longer deny her presence, or the fate that had carried them both back to this place. "I remember you," he whispered, his voice rough as gravel. His thumb grazed the back of her hand, and her lips curved, not into a smile, but into something deeper, something eternal. The land held its breath. The horse stilled, and in the silence, the past and future braided themselves together, tighter than any rope, stronger than any vow spoken under the wide, unyielding sky. The grip of her hand lingered in his palm like the heat of a fire that had smoldered all night, waiting to be stoked again. The cowboy's eyes, weathered and shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, searched hers, but she did not flinch. She stood unbending, as though the earth itself rose beneath her feet to keep her steady. The memory of that night 20 years ago, a night of smoke and arrows and blood that still haunted his dreams, clung to him now with a clarity he had both dreaded and yearned for. He had carried her through fire, her tiny heart thudding against his chest, her cries breaking through the chaos. He had left her with her people because it was the only way he knew how to save her life. And now, impossibly, the circle had closed, and she had come back to him, not as a child in need of rescue but as a woman who carried the weight of destiny in her voice. She had called him her savior, but he never thought of himself that way. A man like him, with hands that had spilled blood and eyes that had seen too much, was not built for redemption. Yet, here she stood, speaking of marriage, of binding herself to him. His chest tightened, the silence between them heavy as iron, as though the air itself waited for his answer. "Why now?" he finally rasped, his voice brittle as old rope. Her lips parted, and her gaze flickered, not with doubt but with the weight of memory. Because I am ready now. My people told me I belong to the man who saved me. But I would not come as a child, nor as a girl still finding her strength. I have fought, I have bled, I have walked the desert alone and faced the spirits of night. I am no longer the little one who clung to your shirt. I am a woman who chooses, and I choose you. The cowboy's eyes narrowed against the ache her words stirred in him. Choice. That was something life had seldom given him. He had not chosen the wars he fought in, nor the outlaws who forced him into duels. He had not chosen the loneliness that came from living too long in a world that left little room for tenderness. Yet now, this woman before him spoke of choice as if it were a gift she held in her palm, extending it toward him. The horse behind them blew out a hot breath, tail swishing against flies. Its presence grounded the moment, a reminder of the simple truths of life out here. Creatures needed feeding, barns needed mending, the seasons rolled on no matter who lived or died. The cowboy pulled his hand back slowly, his jaw tightening. He looked away toward the horizon, where the sun burned low and red, throwing long shadows across the field. You don't know what you're asking, he muttered. Her head tilted, a curtain of black hair falling across her shoulder. She stepped closer, and the scent of earth and smoke clung to her skin. I know enough, she said. I know you live alone in this house of wood and dust. I know you carry ghosts. I know you have no children, no woman to share your fire. I know you remember me, even if you tried to forget. And I know the land does not give second chances lightly. Yet here I stand. Her words were like flint striking stone, sparks flying where his defenses had hardened. He turned back to her, anger flickering for a moment in his chest, though he couldn't tell if it was anger at her or at himself. She had exposed him, peeled back the thin skin he had wrapped over his solitude. And damn it, she was right. The wind picked up, carrying a strand of her hair across his face, brushing his cheek like a whisper. He reached up, almost without thinking, and caught it between his fingers before it could blow away. The gesture stilled them both. His hand, calloused and rough, trembled slightly as it brushed against her skin. I've buried too many people, he said softly, almost to himself. Everyone I've ever cared for is in the ground. You come here talking of binding lives, but you don't know what kind of man I am. You don't know what following me will cost you. Her hand rose, gently but firmly, pressing against his chest. I know you saved me. That is enough. For a long moment, the only sound was the shifting of the horse's hooves and the rustle of grass. The cowboy closed his eyes, fighting the swell inside him. He had lived 20 years believing the girl was just a memory, a ghost of a choice he had once made in a moment of desperation. But here she was, flesh and blood, stronger than the world had any right to make her, looking at him not with fear or obligation but with something that terrified him more, faith. Come inside, he finally said, his voice rough as gravel. They walked toward the cabin together, the horse trailing behind them. The old wood groaned under the weight of the door as he pushed it open, letting her step in first. The cabin smelled of smoke, leather, and loneliness. The table was worn, the bed neatly made but untouched in a way that told the truth of years lived without warmth. She looked around without judgment, her eyes absorbing every detail. He set his hat on the table and leaned against the wall, watching her. She moved with a quiet grace, her bare feet padding across the wooden floor, her hand brushing the edge of the table as if grounding herself in this new place. Finally, she turned to him. Do you want me here? She asked. The question struck him harder than any bullet. Want, need. Those were words he had long since buried. He opened his mouth, closed it, then rubbed a hand across his jaw. I don't know what I want anymore, he admitted. Her eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her fingers lifting to touch the edge of his beard. The touch was feather-light, yet it burned him to the core. Then let me show you, she whispered. The hours that followed moved like the slow shifting of stars. They did not speak much. Words felt too fragile, too clumsy for what passed between them. She sat across from him at the table as he poured water into tin cups, the silence between them thick but not heavy. When their eyes met, it was like stepping into a river, cold, startling, yet alive with a current neither could resist. Night fell, the sky outside painted with silver dust. He lit a lamp, the glow casting shadows across the walls. She sat by the fire, combing her long black hair with her fingers, and he found himself staring, not with lust but with a hunger deeper than flesh, the hunger for connection, for something beyond the empty years. She noticed his gaze and held it, her lips curving slightly. "You still think this is about death?" she said softly. "Isn't it?" he asked, his voice low. "No." She let her hair fall over her shoulders, the firelight making her skin glow like bronze. "It is about destiny. The spirits told me I would find you again. And I did." Destiny. He had never believed in it. He believed in bullets, in blood, in the way men turned on each other when greed outweighed honor. But now, as the firelight flickered between them, as her presence filled the cabin like something he had been waiting for without knowing it, he wondered if maybe destiny had been following him all along, waiting for him to stop running. He reached for his cup, took a long drink, then set it down with a soft clink. "If you stay here," he said, "you'll be living with a man who doesn't know peace. You'll wake to nightmares, to a man who sometimes drinks too much to forget. You'll share your life with someone who ain't fit to be anyone's husband." She rose from her place by the fire, her body moving like smoke, fluid and sure. She crossed the space between them and stood before him, looking down into his shadowed face. Her hand lifted again, resting against his cheek this time. "You saved a life when you had no reason to. That is the only measure of a husband I need." Something inside him cracked then, a dam breaking after years of holding back. He closed his eyes, leaning into her hand, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to breathe without the weight of regret crushing his chest. They spoke little more that night, but their silence was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two souls learning to share the same space, the same fire, the same breath. The night stretched long, the stars wheeled overhead, and in that small cabin, the past and future wove themselves together in threads neither of them fully understood. When the morning came, the sun rose golden over the fields, and for the first time in 20 years, the cowboy woke not to emptiness but to the warmth of another beside him. She lay close, her hair spilling across his chest, her breathing steady, her hand resting over his heart as though she had placed a claim on it that could never be taken back. And he realized, with a certainty that frightened and freed him all at once, that she had not come to repay a debt. She had come to finish a story that had begun long ago, in fire and blood, a story that now demanded its ending in love and belonging. The days that followed were not easy. The land was harsh, the work endless, and the shadows of his past did not simply vanish. But she met each challenge with the same unyielding strength she had shown that first night. When he woke gasping from dreams of gunfire, she was there, grounding him with her touch. When the loneliness rose like a tide, she broke it with her presence, filling the silence with songs of her people, low and haunting, melodies that seemed to heal the air itself. Little by little, the cowboy began to change. His shoulders, once hunched beneath invisible burdens, straightened. His laughter, rare and rusty, began to surface in moments he never expected. And the land, though still unforgiving, seemed to soften under the weight of their shared labor. Fields grew greener, the horse grew stronger, and the cabin that had once been a tomb of solitude became a home. But fate does not weave its patterns without challenge. The world beyond their valley was still restless, and men driven by greed and violence would soon cross their path. And when they did, the bond forged in fire and choice between the cowboy and the woman he had saved would be tested, not by death, not by destiny alone, but by the unbreakable strength of love that had taken root in soil watered by both blood and hope. The days that followed seemed carved from a different life than the cowboy had ever known. Dawn brought more than chores and the bleating of restless livestock. It brought the sight of her standing in the morning light, her hair braided with feathers, her skin painted with the faint ash markings of her people, her eyes sharp and steady. She moved as if the land itself spoke to her, as though the grass and wind bent in quiet reverence. He watched her often when he thought she wasn't looking, his chest tight with a feeling he had never learned to name, a mingling of awe, fear, and a strange kind of peace. She made herself part of his days without asking. When he went to mend fences, she carried the posts on her shoulders, walking with ease across uneven ground. When he hauled water from the creek, she knelt beside him, her reflection rippling in the current as though the earth and sky bent themselves into her. She knew horses too, whispering to them in a tongue he didn't understand, and the animals, skittish under his hands, seemed to calm beneath hers. It unsettled him, How she belonged here so quickly, how the emptiness he had guarded like a fortress began to crumble without resistance. At night, when the fire dimmed and the crickets sang, she told him stories of her people, stories of coyote tricksters, of stars born from sparks, of rivers that remembered every step taken across their banks. Her voice was low, carrying the rhythm of drums and the echo of wind. He sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the flames, but every word burrowed deep, weaving into the gaps in his soul. She wasn't just filling the silence, she was teaching him a different way to hear the world. Still, the cowboy wrestled with the ghosts of his past. There were nights he slipped outside, a bottle in his hand, staring at the horizon as if expecting the sins of his life to rise from the earth and drag him under. Men he had killed returned in dreams, their eyes hollow, their mouths full of blame. He thought he could shield her from that part of him, but she found him every time. Without a word, she would sit beside him, her presence firm as stone, and though she never asked for his confessions, she listened when he whispered them anyway. "I shot a boy once," he told her one night, his voice so raw it startled him. "Not much older than you were when I found you. He had a gun on me, and I didn't wait to see if he meant to use it. His blood hit the dirt before I even thought." Her hand rested on his knee, grounding him. She did not recoil, did not curse him. She only said, "You carry his spirit with you. That is why you saved me. You have been trying to balance the scales ever since." Her words lodged deep in him, deeper than any bullet wound ever had. Time carried them into a rhythm, as though the land itself approved of their union. She began planting herbs in the soil by the cabin, whispering to the seeds as though coaxing them awake. He showed her how to mend tack, how to oil the rifles, though she needed little instruction. She had grown into a warrior in her own right, and though she spoke of peace, he saw the steel in her eyes when she held a blade. She was not a fragile thing he had to protect. She was a force, a storm, and he found himself humbled by her presence. But the peace could not last forever. It never did in his world. One afternoon, as the sun blistered overhead, he heard the distant echo of hooves. He stiffened, the instinct of years snapping awake. No neighbor ever came this far without reason, and no rider approached with such speed unless trouble followed close behind. He motioned for her to stay back, but she had already lifted her bow from the corner, an arrow knocked before he could protest. 3 riders crested the hill, dust swirling behind them. He recognized the type before he even saw their faces, guns loose on their hips, hunger in their eyes, the kind of men who preyed on the weak and claimed what wasn't theirs. Outlaws. He'd known their kind his whole life, had once been closer to them than he cared to admit. The riders slowed, eyes scanning the cabin, the fields, the woman standing at his side. Down his cheek, smiled like a snake. Well, the man drawled, tipping his hat. "Didn't know anyone lived out here. Looks like we found ourselves a prize, boys." The cowboy stepped forward, his body loose but his voice iron. "Ain't nothing here for you. Turn around and ride back the way you came." The man's grin widened, and his gaze slid to her. "Ain't that something? Thought you was living out here alone, but looks like you got company. A wild one, too. Bet she'd fetch a good price if she don't claw my eyes out first." The bowstring creaked as she drew back, the arrow steady as her gaze. The cowboy didn't move, didn't breathe. He knew the look in those men's eyes, the calculation of predators. They would not leave without blood being drawn. The scarred man's smile faltered as the arrow aimed at his chest. "Easy now, girl. She is not your girl," the cowboy said, his voice low, dangerous. "You take one more step, and you won't take another." The moment stretched thin as wire. A crow called in the distance, its cry slicing the silence. Then, with a spit of contempt, the scarred man jerked his reins, pulling his horse back. "Ain't worth it today," he muttered, but his eyes promised return. "We'll be seeing you, old man. And her too." The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared over the ridge, dust rising like smoke in their wake. The cowboy's shoulders sagged with the release of breath, but his heart pounded with the certainty that the peace they had known was now broken. Trouble had found them, and it would not stop until it had its fill. She lowered her bow, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to him, eyes sharp as flint. "They will come back, I know," he said. His voice carried the weight of every battle he had ever fought. "And when they do, we'll be ready." The days that followed were heavy with preparation. He cleaned his rifles, checked his revolvers, taught her the angles of defense around the cabin. She showed him traps her people used, ways of moving unseen through the brush. They trained together until sweat slicked their skin and their muscles burned. At night, they lay awake listening to the wind, every sound in the distance a reminder of what waited. But amidst the tension, something else grew between them, something stronger than fear. In the heat of training, in the quiet of nights spent side by side, their bond deepened. She laughed once, a rare, sudden sound, as he tried and failed to mimic one of her hunting calls, and the sound lit something inside him he thought long dead. He found himself reaching for her hand without thought, and she no longer hesitated to curl her fingers around his. One night, as they sat by the fire, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small token, worn and battered, a silver coin drilled with a hole. "Kept this since I was a boy," he said, holding it out to her. "Figure it's the closest thing I got to a ring. Ain't much, but it's yours if you want it." She took it, her fingers brushing his, her eyes glimmering with something unspoken. "It is more than enough," she whispered, slipping the coin onto a cord and tying it around her neck. When he kissed her for the first time, it was not with urgency but with reverence, as though sealing a vow they had already lived 100 lifetimes to make. But fate, as always, had been listening. At dawn, the sound of hooves returned, more this time, heavier. The horizon darkened with riders, and the cowboy knew the outlaws had come back with vengeance in their hearts. He rose, rifle in hand, his jaw set like stone. She stood beside him, bow ready, her eyes fierce and unafraid. The cabin behind them was no fortress, but the bond they had forged was stronger than walls. As the riders descended like a storm, dust boiling beneath their hooves, the cowboy and the woman he had saved 20 years ago stood together, side by side, not as savior and saved, not as dead and debtor, but as two souls bound by choice, ready to face whatever came with fire in their hearts and the unyielding strength of love. The world seemed to hold its breath as the first shots cracked across the valley, and the story that had begun in flames so long ago threatened to end in them once more. The riders came down the ridge in a rolling tide, their shouts cracking against the air, their rifles glinting in the new sun. Dust rose thick as smoke, and the thunder of hooves shook the ground. The cowboy stood with his rifle leveled, steady as a fence post, his jaw locked. Beside him, she crouched, bow drawn, the string pulled back until it hummed with the taut promise of death. The cabin stood at their backs, and the horse stamped nervously, sensing the storm. The first shot rang out. The cowboy squeezed his trigger, and a rider at the front pitched sideways, his body slamming into the dirt before his horse even slowed. She loosed her arrow at the same instant, the shaft slicing through the air to sink into another man's throat. The rider gurgled, clutching at the wood, before tumbling beneath the hooves of his own beast. The charge faltered, the outlaws cursing, scattering just enough to make themselves harder targets. Inside, he barked, shoving her toward the cabin. She darted in, the bow still in her hand, and he followed, slamming the door. The wood shuddered under the next volley of bullets, splinters flying. They ducked low, crawling across the floor to the small slit windows he'd carved long ago, never imagining he'd need them again. He shoved the barrel through one and fired, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. Another rider screamed, toppling. She loosed 2 more arrows in quick succession, her movements fluid, eyes calm as a hawk's. The cabin became a hive of noise, the whistle of bullets, the sharp snap of her bowstring, the thunder of rifles. He reloaded with shaking hands, sweat stinging his eyes, but when he glanced at her, she was composed, her breathing steady, her focus absolute. It steadied him too, pulled him back from the panic that threatened to swallow. A bullet punched through the wall inches from his head, showering him in dust. He swore and ducked. The outlaws had dismounted now, using trees and rocks for cover, firing in bursts meant to pin them down. It was only a matter of time before they circled and closed in. She touched his arm, her eyes burning. "We cannot wait for them to burn us out. We must move." He looked at her, his jaw tight. She was right. They could not win a siege here. The cabin was wood and nails, not stone. He thought of all he'd built in this place, the years of sweat carved into every board, but none of it mattered compared to her. Survival was what mattered. "You go first," he said, pointing toward the back. Slip through the creek bed. I'll cover you. She shook her head, fierce. We go together. Another volley cracked, a bullet grazing the edge of the window. He cursed, grabbing her wrist. Don't argue. You're faster. You know the land better. Get to the ridge, lay cover. I'll follow. Her lips pressed tight, her eyes flashing, but she saw the determination in him. She leaned forward suddenly, kissed him hard, and then darted toward the back door. She slipped into the tall grass, vanishing like a shadow. He turned back, firing 3 more shots in quick succession, keeping the outlaws pinned. Screams erupted moments later, sharp and unexpected. He risked a glance and saw 2 riders stagger, arrows buried deep in their chests. She had already reached the ridge and was raining death down from above. Pride and fear warred in his chest, but there was no time to dwell. He kicked the back door open, bolted into the brush, and rolled down into the creek bed. Bullets whined overhead, snapping branches. He scrambled up the slope, firing blindly to keep them back. She was waiting at the top, bow still smoking with use. Her hand shot out, pulling him the last few feet, and together they crouched behind the rocks. The outlaws regrouped below, shouting curses, their numbers. Thinned but still strong. He counted 6 left, including the scarred leader. The scarred man's voice rang across the field. You can't run forever, old man. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you live. The cowboy spat into the dirt. His voice boomed back, rough and steady. You want her, you'll have to crawl through hell first. The man laughed, ugly and mean, and motioned his men forward. The fight stretched on, bullets and arrows trading places with screams and curses. One outlaw tried to flank from the left, but she caught him with an arrow through the eye. Another rushed up the slope, revolver blazing, and the cowboy met him with a shot that snapped his head back like a rag doll. The scarred man pressed on, his fury burning hotter with every loss. Finally, he broke cover, charging up the hill, revolver in hand. The cowboy fired, missed, fired again, the shot grazing the man's shoulder. The outlaw roared, closing the distance. Then she was there, stepping out from cover, her bow lowered, a knife glinting in her hand. The scarred man's eyes widened at the sight of her, but his momentum didn't falter. He swung his gun toward her. The cowboy's shout tore from his throat, but before the trigger could be pulled, she lunged. The knife flashed once, twice, sinking into flesh. The man gasped, his revolver clattering to the ground. She yanked the blade free, her face fierce, her body unyielding. The outlaw staggered, eyes wide with disbelief, then crumpled into the dirt. The valley fell silent but for the ragged sound of their breathing. Smoke drifted from the cowboy's rifle barrel. The last outlaw, seeing his leader fall, turned and fled, his horse kicking up dust as he vanished over the ridge. The cowboy lowered his rifle slowly, his heart hammering. She stood over the scarred man's body, her chest rising and falling, the knife still dripping. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable, then dropped the blade and walked toward him. He caught her as she reached him, pulling her into his arms. For a long moment, they said nothing, only clung to each other, their bodies trembling with the shock of survival. His lips pressed to her hair, and he breathed in the scent of smoke, sweat, and earth. When they finally pulled apart, her eyes glimmered with something fierce and bright. We are bound now, more than ever, she whispered. Blood has sealed it. He cupped her face in his rough hands, his thumb brushing her cheek. His voice cracked, low and raw. I thought I'd lost you. You will never lose me, she said. Not in this life, not in any other. They buried the bodies far from the cabin, stacking stones over shallow graves, a grim reminder of the cost of defiance. The cowboy said little during the work, his hands steady but his eyes shadowed. She moved beside him without complaint, her silence carrying as much weight as his. When the last stone was set, they stood together, looking out over the valley. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in blood and fire. He slipped his hand into hers, and she squeezed back, her grip strong. That night, their fire burned low, but their bodies found each other with a need that words could never touch. The battle had stripped them raw, and in that rawness, they clung tighter, mouths hungry, hands desperate, as though to remind themselves that they were alive, that they had won, that the bond between them was stronger than death. In the days that followed, life did not return to what it had been. The land was the same, the chores unchanged, but the air around them was different, heavy with the knowledge that they had been tested and endured. She trained harder, her eyes sharper than before. He found himself softening, laughing more freely, his heart loosening in ways he hadn't thought possible. They built new defenses around the cabin, stronger fences, deeper trenches, but they also built something more invisible. Trust, shared without hesitation, a rhythm that made them more than two people living side by side. They became one breath, one will, one flame. At times, he would wake in the night, staring at the ceiling, the ghost still whispering. But now, when he turned, she was there, her hand resting on his chest, her warmth pressing the darkness back. She told him once, in the quiet before dawn, that the spirits had guided her to him not just to repay a life, but to save him in return. He believed her. Seasons shifted. The snow came, blanketing the valley in silence, then melted into spring. She planted more herbs, coaxed life from the earth with a patience he envied. He carved her a bow from the strongest yew he could find, smoothing it with care until it gleamed. When he gave it to her, she kissed him softly, her gratitude spilling from her eyes more than her lips. They faced storms, wild animals, the endless grind of survival, but nothing shook them as much as the day she told him she carried life inside her. Her hand pressed to her belly, her voice steady, her eyes shining. For a moment, he could not breathe. Fear seized him, fear of what kind of father he could be, fear of what kind of world this was for a child. But she silenced him with a touch, her words soft but unwavering. This child is the joining of us. It will carry your strength and my spirit. It is not a thing to fear, but to honor. He wept then, openly, his arms wrapped around her as though she were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. For the first time, he understood that the story which had begun in fire 20 years ago had never been about saving one life. It had always been about creating another, about turning blood and loss into something new, something eternal. When the child was born months later, beneath the vast and endless sky, he held it in trembling hands, staring down at the tiny face, the dark eyes blinking open for the first time. She leaned against him, exhausted but radiant, her hand resting over his. "This is why I came back to you," she whispered. And he knew then, without doubt, that every bullet, every scar, every lonely night had led to this moment, to this family, to this love. The land around them was still harsh, the world beyond still dangerous, but within the circle of their arms, within the fire that burned between them, there was a home no outlaw, no ghost, no storm could ever take away. The boy grew strong beneath the wide sky, his first cries soon replaced by laughter that carried across the valley. The cowboy, who had once lived in silence so deep it had pressed against his bones, now woke to the sound of small feet running across wooden floors and a child's voice calling out for him. At first, he had not known what to do with the boy. His hands felt too rough, his presence too heavy. But the woman guided him, with patience and quiet strength, showing him that fatherhood was not about perfection, but about presence. The child inherited his mother's sharp eyes and his father's broad shoulders. By 5, he could track rabbits through the brush as though the earth itself whispered their path. By 7, he rode bareback on the horse, gripping the mane with fearless ease. The cowboy often watched him with a heart so full it hurt, pride mixing with a fear he could not shake. For every laugh, he saw a shadow of the dangers waiting beyond their valley. For every moment of joy, he remembered the blood that had soaked this land. The woman saw the worry in him and touched his arm. He was born of battle and love both. Do not fear for him. He carries our spirits. The cowboy nodded, but fear is not a thing easily banished. He taught the boy to shoot, though his heart twisted every time the child held the heavy revolver. He trained him in the art of survival, in reading clouds, in listening to the wind. The boy's laughter often softened his worry, but still, the cowboy lay awake at night, listening for riders in the distance, waiting for the past to return. And, as the years turned, it did. One autumn evening, as the light faded to copper, riders appeared once more on the ridge. Not outlaws this time, but men in worn uniforms, carrying the weight of law twisted by greed. They claimed the valley belonged to the government, that settlers had no right to live on it without papers signed in far-off offices. The cowboy knew better than to trust such men. They wanted the land, the water, the timber. They wanted power. When the soldier at the front spoke, His voice was full of steel. "You've squatted here long enough. Pack up and move on, or we'll see to it you're gone by force." The cowboy stood tall, rifle in hand, the woman at his side, their boy peeking from the doorway. His voice cut through the cool air. "This land is ours, paid for with blood. You'll take nothing here." The soldiers laughed, but the sound carried unease. They had heard stories, whispers of the cowboy who had carved a life from wilderness, who had faced down outlaws and lived. The woman, with her fierce eyes and unshakable presence, unsettled them further. Still, greed is a stubborn disease. They promised to return with more men. That night, the cabin was quiet but heavy. The boy sat close, sensing the tension. The woman braided his hair, her voice low as she told him stories of ancestors who faced storms and survived. The cowboy sat cleaning his rifle, each motion deliberate, his mind caught between fear and determination. When the boy asked, "Will they hurt us?" the cowboy froze. He looked into those wide eyes, so full of trust, and for a moment he could not speak. The woman answered instead, her voice steady. "No, because we stand together." The soldiers did return, more of them, carrying rifles and arrogance. They came at dawn, the sun barely cresting the horizon. The valley echoed with shouts, the stomp of boots. The cowboy and the woman stood side by side at the edge of their land, the boy just behind, clutching a bow too large for his small hands. The soldier in command raised his hand. "Last chance. Leave." The cowboy's voice was calm but unyielding. "This land remembers us. It remembers every drop of blood spilled to claim it. You'll have to walk through that memory to take it from us." The standoff hung heavy, the air charged. The boy's breath quickened, the horse stamped nervously, the wind stilled. Then the first shot cracked, and chaos erupted. The battle that followed was unlike the skirmish with outlaws years before. This was a storm, disciplined and relentless. Bullets tore into the earth, smoke filled the air. The cowboy fired with precision, dropping men with every pull of the trigger, but they were many. The woman moved like a shadow, her arrows singing through the air, each one finding its mark. The boy, trembling but unafraid, loosed his first shaft, and it struck true, a man collapsing in shock. The soldiers pressed harder, their numbers forcing the family back toward the cabin. The cowboy fought like a man possessed, each shot carrying the weight of everything he had to lose. He was no longer fighting for himself, but for them, for the woman who had chosen him, for the child born of their love, for the life carved from ashes. But even the fiercest fire can be overwhelmed. A bullet tore through his side, the pain searing. He staggered, nearly falling, but she caught him, her hands bloody, her eyes burning. "Stand," she urged, her voice fierce. "You cannot fall now." He forced himself upright, teeth gritted, firing again. She pressed forward too, her knife flashing as soldiers closed the distance. They fought as one body, one spirit, their movements bound by years of love and survival. The boy stood at the cabin door, loosing arrows with shaking hands, his face set with determination beyond his years. He shouted once, a cry that the echo of his own youth, the same defiance that had carried him through war. The battle stretched long, men falling, the earth soaked with blood. And when it ended, the valley lay silent once more. Bodies scattered, smoke drifting. The surviving soldiers fled, fear in their eyes, leaving behind only the memory of their failure. The cowboy collapsed to his knees, blood soaking his shirt. The woman dropped beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, her face set in grim determination. The boy knelt too, tears streaking his dirt-stained cheeks. "I'm here," the cowboy rasped, his voice weak. Don't you cry, boy. You're strong, stronger than me. You won't leave," the boy choked, gripping his father's arm. "You can't." The cowboy's hand lifted, trembling, resting against his son's cheek. "Listen to me. You'll carry this land. You'll carry her. That's all that matters. You're my blood, my hope." The woman leaned close, her tears falling onto his skin. "Do not speak of leaving," she whispered fiercely. "Not now, not ever." His eyes softened as he looked at her, the woman who had come to him from fire, who had bound herself to him by choice, who had given him everything. His voice broke. "You were my salvation. From the day I pulled you from the ashes, you saved me more than I saved you." Her lips pressed to his forehead, her voice trembling but strong. And I will carry you with me for all my days. The boy's sobs quieted, his small hand gripping his father's until it stilled. The cowboy's last breath slipped into the morning air, carried by the wind across the valley he had defended. His body sagged, his face peaceful in a way it had not been in decades. The woman did not wail. She held him, rocking gently, her eyes fierce even through tears. She whispered words in her people's tongue, prayers that bound his spirit to the land. The boy pressed against her, his face buried in her side, his small body shaking. They buried him at the highest point of the ridge, where the valley stretched wide and endless below. Stones marked the grave, each one placed by hand, each one heavy with memory. The woman sang as she worked, her voice carrying across the wind, weaving sorrow into strength. The boy helped, silent, his small hands steady. When the last stone was laid, she stood tall, the boy's hand in hers. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson. She looked out across the valley, her voice low but certain. He is the land now. He will never leave us. Years passed, and the boy grew into a man. He carried his father's rifle across his back and his mother's bow in his hand. The valley flourished under his care, the cabin expanding into a home filled with life and laughter. The woman, her hair streaked with silver, watched with pride as her son carved his own story, guided by the spirits of both his parents. And when he had children of his own, he brought them to the ridge, to the grave of the cowboy. He told them the story of how a man once pulled a little Apache girl from fire, and how she returned to bind her life to his. He told them how love stronger than death had carved their family from ashes, how every stone in the valley remembered their names. The wind carried those stories, passing them from generation to generation, until the valley itself seemed to whisper them in the rustle of grass and the call of birds. The cowboy lived on in every sunrise, in every breath of his children's children, in the strength of the woman who had loved him beyond fear, beyond fate. And though the world outside changed, though empires rose and fell, the story of the cowboy and the little Apache girl remained, eternal as the land itself. A story not of debt, not of destiny, but of love, fierce and unyielding, born of fire and sealed in blood. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.